I'd like to welcome you all to Book Passage. Thank you for coming out tonight, supporting your local independent bookstore. Today, Book Passage is very proud to welcome Adam Benforado, Associate Professor of Law at Drexel University and former attorney at Jenner Block. Adam is also an author and has published numerous essays which have appeared in a variety of noted periodicals, including The Washington Post, The Philadelphia Inquirer, and Legal Times. Adam's vast experience with the judicial system is the foundation for his book, Unfair: The New Science of Criminal Injustice. This book is not only a critical examination of our judicial system, but also sheds an important light on the profound inequities that exist not only within our judicial system, but also, interestingly, within all of us. So with that, I will hand it over to Adam Benforado.
So thank you so much for the warm introduction. It really is nice to be here. This is one of my favorite parts of the country. I was so happy when the book publicist said, we're sending you to Northern California. And it's not only the beautiful country that you have here and the wonderful food and nice weather. It's also that this is a place that I think has a special commitment to social justice. And I think it's not that everyone here believes that there is no injustice around them. It's this commitment to making the world a better place and acknowledging that it is imperfect and that we have a lot of work to do. So what is this book about, this book Unfair? Well, it's about the hidden forces that shape the behavior of judges and jurors, and detectives and witnesses, and countless others in our criminal justice system. So each chapter focuses on one of these core characters, and I contrast the conventional stories that we tell about how these people make decisions and where things go wrong with what the latest evidence from psychology and neuroscience has to say. So tonight, I just want to give you a taste, a delicious taste, but a taste nonetheless, of what's inside the book. And so I'm going to focus on just 3 myths about the criminal justice system. The first myth is that all victims are equal in the eyes of the law. After any high-profile incident, you'll hear a prosecutor, Trayvon Martin, for instance, the prosecutor will come out and tell you exactly that. We see all victims the same. We're going to check whether that's actually true. Second, when eyewitness identifies someone with certainty, we can feel confident that we got the right guy. Yes, and people are shaking their head. You see where this is going. Third, judicial bias is subject to introspection and control. Essentially, if you're going to be an activist judge or an umpire judge, you just make that choice. Easy as can be. All right, so let's start out with victims. And I actually want to start us on the East Coast tonight, Washington, D.C., a few years ago. It's a winter night, and a man named Jerry steps out to get something from his car. Wearing his slippers, and he sees a body lying on the sidewalk. So as he approaches, the man is alive. He's sort of trying to sit up, moaning, unable to speak, and he keeps falling back, kind of bumping his head. So Jerry rushes over, puts his slippered foot under the man's head, and his wife goes in and calls 911. A few minutes later, fire truck pulls up around the corner, and as soon as the firefighters get out, the man begins to vomit. And one of the firefighters says, I smell alcohol. It's a drunk. So when the police arrive, they're told, well, nothing to see here. It's just a homeless drunk. So the cops keep to the periphery. And when the EMTs arrive, same thing. In fact, the crew leader says, what? We drove all this way just for an ETOH, which is shorthand for a drunk? They put him in the back. Instead of going to the closest hospital, as is required by protocol, the crew leader says, well, let's go to the hospital close to my home because I need to run some errands. They drop him at the hospital. He's put just in a side hallway because, again, this is just a drunk. he can sleep it off. So this is how things are going until all of a sudden one of the nurses walks by this man and hears his breathing. And it's this kind of growling snore. So she goes over and she gives him a sternum rub. And his arms and legs kind of go inward, which is a sign not of drunkenness, but of a head injury. So, doctor sees all of this happening, rushes over, they take him to the resuscitation room, the trauma team's called in, but it's too late. He dies. Now it turns out that this was no drunk. This was David Rosenbaum, an award-winning New York Times reporter, a luminary of Washington. What had happened? Well, he'd had dinner with his wife, as he usually did. Got the hiccups. Decided to go on a little walk to try to cure himself. Two guys jumped out, hit him in the head with a bar, robbed him. So we can see here in this case how justice is not blind when it comes to victims. And I think what this case illustrates very well is that how in assessing victims, we often sum them up automatically and quickly based on what's directly in front of us. That might be the color of their skin. It might be their age. It might be whether they appear rich or poor. It might be the smell on their breath. And these initial assumptions that we make then shape everything that comes later in a case. So one of the psychological demonstrations I mention in the book involved two groups of students who were brought in and asked to draw a young man's face while looking at his photograph. This photograph, in fact. Now, obviously, what's important is what they are seeing here. That should determine what the image they draw turns out to be. Now, the only difference between these two groups was that one group was told, this is a black guy. Another group was told, this is a white guy. Again, people have the picture in front of them. The label is completely irrelevant. But what happened? Well, when people were given the label black, they tended to draw in a way that looked more like a stereotypical black person. And when they had that label white, they tended to draw someone who looked more like a stereotypical white person, even though they were looking at that same image. Now, one of the things that's really damaging about labels is that once they are attached, they are very, very hard to remove. So we saw that with David Rosenbaum. Once he was labeled as a drunk, all the other evidence that these other actors came upon was all sorted with that frame in mind. So there were actually a lot of signals here that this was not a drunk person. In fact, his symptoms even did not appear to just be a drunk person. His pupils were very dilated. His lack of speech, his motor control problems. If someone had just simply added up all of these things, they would have seen, well, this does not add up to simple drunkenness. But no one did that because they had these blinders on. In fact, they might have noticed all of these signs that this was a robbery. The man's back pocket had been ripped out of his pants. This did not look like a homeless drunk either. He had a wedding ring and a nice watch on. This looked like a robbery. In fact, he had head trauma if they had only looked for it. Now, this is a major problem, not just for EMTs, firefighters, hospital workers, police officers. It's also a major problem for forensic lab technicians. Confirmation bias, you might think, couldn't possibly affect something as objective as matching up fingerprints or matching DNA. But we know from experimental work that when lab technicians have been given information about a suspect that suggests you should find a match here because, say, we already have a confession or we already have a couple of eyewitnesses who identify this person, they are far more likely, those lab technicians, to find a match. So I think we ought to adopt blind testing. We have it in medical fields, and it's been very, very helpful there. It's just logical that we extend that to forensic testing as well. Now let's turn to our second myth of the night. And for this one, we're going to actually we're going to move down the East Coast a little bit, down to Meriwether County, Georgia. It's 1979, and there's been a brutal rape. The victim, a couple of weeks later, is brought in to do a lineup. And the very interesting thing about this case is that that lineup has been preserved. She looked at these 5 men, looked them over, and she said, that one, number 3, John Jerome White. John Jerome White said, I did not rape that lady. Said in court, he was adamant, I did not rape that lady. Jury convicted him. He spent something like 2 decades in prison. DNA evidence, though, had been saved. We didn't have the means to test it in 1979, but we did a couple decades later. He was innocent. Now, when I came across this photograph, I'd read a lot of cases in which eyewitnesses misidentified people and people spent many years in prison. That was not what shocked me about this photograph. What shocked me about this photograph is the real perpetrator is in this photograph. He just happened to be locked up in the jail on a completely unrelated crime. He was pulled in as a filler. Just go in, stand here. And that means that the victim looked this man in the eyes and said, nope, number 3. And I think why this is just so stunning to me, right, is that it shows that well-intentioned, good people with every incentive in the world to get it right, get it wrong. And that leads to terrible, terrible injustice. We know that every year tens of thousands of Americans are charged with crimes after they're identified by eyewitnesses. Now, what else do we know? Well, psychologists and statisticians have been collecting data. We know that 1/3 of the time in real lineups, an eyewitness picks out a filler. That is, one of the innocent people in the lineup. We also know that out of the first 250 DNA exonerations in the United States, 190 of them involved mistaken identifications. So what's behind these problems? Well, first of all, our memories don't work like cameras. When you ask a wide cross-section of Americans, that's what people often say. We can admit that our filing systems aren't always so organized, that sometimes we place that photograph in a back corner of our brains and it's covered with dust and it's hard to find, but it's in there somewhere, a picture of objective reality. Well, that's not correct. And there are many things that can negatively impact how well we encode and recall a memory. So it turns out we're a lot better at identifying someone if they're the same race as we are. If you're a white guy like me, it's a lot harder for you to identify someone who is black. Also turns out that it's a lot harder to identify someone later if you saw them at dusk as opposed to midday. Maybe that's somewhat obvious. The magnitude, though, of the effect is not so obvious. Also matters whether we just physically exerted ourselves. If we exerted ourselves at the moment that we saw someone, it's harder to remember them later. Now, all of these problems I've just mentioned are not really in control of the criminal justice system. But there's a lot of stuff that the police officers actually do that causes major problems. And I think one of the biggest problems here, if we just looked at the handling of eyewitnesses, is that we don't handle eyewitness memory in the same way that we handle other types of evidence. So think about a blood-stained handkerchief. How carefully we are not to corrupt that sample. How carefully we are to pick it up, to preserve it, to document the chain of control of that piece of evidence. But with eyewitness memories, we allow them to be corrupted, and they change over time. Memories are very fragile and changeable, but we don't do a lot to preserve those memories. In this case, the victim first was brought in to look at a bunch of pictures. Then she did a lineup, and finally, she did an in-court identification. Now that is very convincing to a jury. Think about if you're a juror. Well, this woman identified the guy 3 times. She must have been certain that he was the one who did it. But if you think about it, what if she guessed on that first one? Well, how about when she was later brought in for this lineup? Maybe she was just remembering the person she'd seen in that photo book earlier. And down the line, when she was in court, maybe she was just remembering those other 2 times. And think about the pressures on someone who did have doubts in court. Everyone's sitting around, they're all looking at you, and you're going to say, you know what? Maybe I got it wrong at that moment. With all of these cops who've worked the case counting on you, with the prosecutors counting on you, no way. So that's one reason I think that we not only need to treat eyewitness memory a lot more like we treat other trace evidence, but we also need to just be very, very careful with how we handle eyewitness identifications in court. In fact, I think we should get rid of them. All right, good. Now, let's move to our final myth for the night, our final taste on this tasting menu. So, as I mentioned, in the United States, we have 2 ideas about judges. On the one hand, we think, well, they're activist judges. These are ideological people who decide that their own personal agendas are more important than following the law. And then on the other hand, we have these enlightened umpire judges. If you want to become a Supreme Court justice, you must tell all of those assembled senators that you will be an umpire. You will just call balls and strikes. You will apply the objective law to the neutral facts. Now, is that true? Surprise, surprise, psychologists have looked into it, and it's not true. Judges are susceptible to numerous biases. Everything from implicit racial biases, which lead them to make higher bails for African Americans, be more likely to rule against in motions against African American attorneys, all different types of problems like that, to stuff that seems really bizarre. So one of my favorite experiments in the book actually took place in Israel. And these researchers decided that they wanted to look into this question of what determines whether someone gets parole or not. So I teach criminal law. I would have told my students before reading this paper that the thing that was most important was what type of crime this person did. Second most important thing I would have said, well, how did they do in prison? Did they get in a lot of fights? Did they have a good record of helping out? Did they follow the rules? Those things, though, in the experiment, did not predict whether people got parole. What predicted it best? Time of day of appearing before the panel. For future use, the best time to appear before that panel, first thing in the morning. Worst time to appear? Right before one of the 2 breaks in the day. So some of you have probably been told in your life, right? Don't buy a car that was made on, is it a Monday? Well, don't go before that parole board, at 11 o'clock in Israel. That's the bad time to go.
We'll remember that, won't we?
All right. So, to talk a little bit more about judges, I want to look at a particular Supreme Court case from a few years back. And this took place in a suburb outside of Atlanta. And this young man, 19-year-old Victor Harris, goes by a speed trap. He's going 73 in a 55. Not that anyone in this room, I'm sure, has ever done that. But rather than slow down, 19-year-old Victor Harris hits the gas. So the cop chases him. A lot of jurisdictions, they ban that practice, but not here. So cop decides to chase him. Another officer joins the chase, Timothy Scott. And Timothy Scott has been trained to use a pit technique to stop police chases. Now there are very strict rules about pitting a vehicle. Not supposed to do it at high speeds, not supposed to do it when it's a dangerous situation, for instance, where there's a gully on the side. But Officer Scott asks for permission over the radio, gets permission to pit the vehicle, and decides to do it at high speeds with a gully on the side. Bumps the back bumper. Victor Harris's car spins out, turns over. He's paralyzed from the neck down. So he decides to sue Officer Scott under the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable seizures. His argument essentially is based on Supreme Court precedent that says you can't shoot a shoplifter in the back as he's running away. You also can't use a potentially lethal technique on someone who's just committed a minor traffic violation. In this case, there was no evidence that that this car was stolen. They actually had his address. There was no other crime here that was of any major concern. So in the lower court, Harris won on the grounds that Scott's actions were unreasonable. But in the Supreme Court, things went quite differently. Now, the funny thing about this case is that normally the Supreme Court defers to the factual findings of the lower court. That's the system that we have. After all, those are the people on the ground who are actually looking at, the testimony and everything. But the Supreme Court here said there's something curious about this case, something different about this case. And that is the fact that we actually have a videotape of all of the events. And we watched this videotape. And Justice Scalia says during oral argument, I watched this, and this is the most dangerous police chase I've ever seen since the French Connection. So, the Supreme Court decides no reasonable juror could possibly watch this videotape and not believe that it was anything but extremely dangerous and that Victor was to blame for his own paralysis. And Justice Scalia does something very interesting that had never been done before. He actually posts the video on the Supreme Court website to watch. He's so sure no reasonable person could possibly watch this and see anything differently. So some clever law professors decide to test that out. Is it true that no reasonable person could possibly watch this videotape and see the facts differently? So they asked a very broad cross-section of Americans, and what did they find? Well, distinct subgroups of citizens saw the facts very differently. So white, conservative, older men tended to side with Justice Scalia. They saw a very dangerous police chase and the culprit being Victor Harris. But young African-American liberal women living on the East Coast tended to actually see the police as the ones who were at fault in creating this danger. Their view was, well, he never would have ran if the police hadn't chased him. They should have called it off, as other jurisdictions do. And if anyone created a lethal danger to the public, it was the police in this case. Now, one thing that's interesting is we're talking about facts, and the fact that most of us believe that there is an objective take on reality out there. This cultural cognition research suggests maybe not. Maybe our backgrounds and experiences shape our understanding of reality. Broad set of researchers have actually looked at the law. So we've been talking about the facts. They've also looked at the law. Now, I just finished teaching last semester criminal law. One of the subjects that I taught was rape law. My casebook has about 70 pages, all about the nuances here. And our casebook says it's very, very important whether you're in a state that, for instance, recognizes a defense for a reasonably mistaken belief in consent. My casebook says that's going to determine and say date rape case, whether the man is convicted or found not to be guilty. Now, researchers decided to check that out. So they varied these statutes, used the same scenario, and they varied these statutes so that they reflected all the different ways that the different criminal codes in the United States define rape. What they found didn't matter at all. You could have that defense in, could have it out, not in, didn't affect the outcome. What affected the outcome? Who the jurors were, who their backgrounds and experiences were. So again, there were distinct divisions based on subgroups of citizens. And the divisions weren't necessarily what you expected. So the researchers went in thinking, well, it's going to be a big difference between men and women. That's going to be what really matters. That wasn't what really mattered. There was actually a really interesting divide within women. Older conservative women with traditional gender norm values tended to let the guy off in this date rape scenario. Younger liberal women tended to find him guilty. Again, the law didn't affect either of them, what the law actually said. But these distinct identities played a major role. Now there's another reason that we need to be skeptical of videotape's ability to offer a singular objective take on reality. And that's something that psychologists have dubbed perspective bias. Now this is actually a clip from the original video. And one of the things that's very interesting about this, when I read this case and watched this video, is that I immediately thought, well, that's offering a very specific frame on what is happening. Whose frame is that? Well, it's the police officer's frame. We're sitting actually in his position. We are seeing what he is seeing. We're actually hearing exactly what he is hearing. And I thought to myself, what if we had a different perspective? What if we were actually in Victor Harris's position? What if we were seeing what he was seeing? Maybe suddenly we'd start to think of things differently. Maybe what happened was Victor Harris, 19-year-old guy, impulsive, made a bad initial decision, hit the gas. And then, though, he looked back and saw flashing lights and thought, what am I going to do? I can't stop. Now there are two police officers following me. I'm a black guy in a remote area with not a lot of witnesses around, and I know what happens when you run from the cops. I can't stop. I can't do it. They'll kill me. We don't have that perspective, though. Now, the cool thing is, I had these intuitions about it, and then I went and looked into the research. Well, it turns out psychologists have actually been looking at all this stuff, and they've been looking in the particular context of interrogations. So you would think if we give people a videotape of an interrogation, it doesn't matter what perspective we offer when we're deciding whether this is a coerced interrogation or not. But when researchers looked at it, they found it mattered quite a lot. When they placed the camera behind the detective with his perspective, people tended to find the confession totally voluntary. But when they switched where the camera was and showed people different video footage, people suddenly started to see things from the perspective of the person being interrogated and started to feel all of those coercive elements. And so they tended to say, well, no, that's not voluntary. That confession can't come in. So I think this suggests that recent moves around the country in the wake of these incidents of alleged police brutality, a lot of communities have said, what we need to do is we need every police officer to be wearing a camera. Maybe it's on their sunglasses, maybe it's on their lapel. This will solve all of our problems. I'm not so sure. So there's good research that suggests that when people are being monitored, they do change their behavior. I think that's true, and that's a reason why videotape as a general matter is a good idea. Rikers Island, just as part of a negotiated settlement, is considering installing cameras around the complex. I think that's a great idea. I think that will have a noticeable impact on violence within that space. But I worry about using only the perspective of police officers, whether that's squad car camera or whether that's a worn camera. I think that if that evidence ends up in an actual trial, it's going to stack cards against the defendant. And I worry about that. So I think that anything that's offered as evidence ought to be from a third party perspective. That is, showing both the parties in the same frame. In experiments, that is a good way to sort of control for this camera perspective bias. Now, in each chapter of this book, I focus on specific reforms like the ones I've talked about. But I think that we actually need to think about the bigger picture as well. Broader changes. Indeed, I think we might think about it as a revolution. And I think what we need, the biggest thing, is we need to commit ourselves to evidence-based justice. We have evidence-based medicine. For a long time, doctors decided on treatments, gave people medicine based on intuitions, an anecdote. People, though, in the medical community started to think, well, this is a bad way to decide what's effective. We should collect data. We should run experiments to figure out what works best. And that's been such a benefit to all of us in this room who as a daily matter, right, benefit from all of those robust findings. Business has undergone an evidence-based revolution. With billions of dollars on the stake, it's no longer good enough to go with your gut. Top Fortune 500 companies now know, no, we've got to collect data and analyze that data. And that's how we make more money. Sports teams are increasingly, across all sports, moving towards collecting data, doing analysis. But law has been resistant to such developments. Why is that? Well, I think with respect to law, we have this thought that somehow the people who made our laws over a period of hundreds of years were somehow more enlightened, more brilliant, more special than we are. Even if that was true, they don't have the amazing tools that we now have. They do not have MRI machines to look at human brains. They do not have complex statistical analyses and computer programs. They do not have the ability to now cast a wide net and get 5,000 subjects in an hour in a psychological experiment. We have these tools and we're not using them to improve outcomes in our criminal justice system. I think that has to happen right away. Now, the thing that I most fear is that we are at a unique moment. I have been working on this subject for a very long time. I've been specifically writing this book for about 4 years, and I could not have foreseen what would be happening in the United States over these last few months. It is a unique opportunity. In traveling around the country, I have been talking to people who are genuinely committed to making changes. The book's been out just a week, but I've received 3 emails from police officers. I've gotten messages from judges. People want this stuff. They are committed. They agree the current system is not working. I was just in Washington giving a talk at Politics in Prose, and there were a couple of political people there talking to me about some of the efforts actually bridging the gap. There are so few issues in the United States that people can come to the table to even discuss. Conservatives and liberals in Washington have different things they want out of, say, reducing the prison rolls, but they're both committed to the same thing. It's a very exciting time. So why am I worried? Because we all have this limited tolerance for injustice. We can come to a talk for 20 minutes, and then that's kind of enough. looking at that bad stuff. And so the thing that I'm going to ask those of you in the audience who at least have agreed, if you haven't agreed, no problem. If you have agreed with a lot of the stuff that I've said, if you think that this is a problem, I urge you not to let it go. Talk to someone about what you heard tonight. Tell them about the book. And if not the book, tell them about other efforts that are going on to reform our criminal justice system. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm more than happy to talk about whatever you'd like in the Q&A. Yeah. Thanks.
We had a terrible situation in Santa Rosa where a 12-year-old kid was shot in the back by a sheriff. Did you hear about that Andy Lopez case?
Yeah.
The guy's back out working. Nothing happened. He feared for his life, quote unquote. Give me a break. Also, I had a beautiful girlfriend that was killed in a police chase. She got hit by a cop that was chasing some guy for nothing. On and on. The arrogance of judges, unbelievable.
Yeah. So I think, there are, I'm sure, a lot of people in this audience who have personal experiences, bad experiences, or have friends who have had bad experiences with the criminal justice system. And certainly, I would think everyone in this room has read the numerous articles that are published literally every day. I mean, the New York Times has an article every day about some injustice that's happening in the United States. And the question is, why is it happening? Now, one of the things that I think sets my book apart from a lot of the other stories that are being offered in the media is that I don't think that the causes of most of the problems have to do with bad people in our midst. I think there are a few bigoted cops left in police departments, true racists who are out to shoot young African American men. But I don't think that's why we are seeing all of these shootings of young African American men. I think the main reason for that is implicit racial bias. We are all exposed to pervasive stereotypes that link the concept of blackness with crime and violence. I'm from Philadelphia, turn on the 5 o'clock news in Philadelphia, and you will be hit with images of young black men and stories about crime. Turn on, right, Law and Order, any of these cop shows, there are dozens of them. Look at who the perps tend to be. Look at the people in the background at prisons. I mean, in prison scenes or in jail scenes. We are hit over the head with this linkage of black and dangerous. So police officers, in writing this book, I actually went on a couple of ride-alongs with police officers in Philadelphia and in Brooklyn. And one of the things that really struck me was that a lot of what they do is very boring. A lot of it is just kind of sitting around, it's filling out, someone's motorcycle may have been stolen, but maybe the person just forgot where it was, and that's 3 hours of your day. And then all of a sudden, you are in a terrible situation. So I'll tell you, in Philadelphia, one of the calls that we went out for was domestic violence. Alleged some kids were screaming in the house. Get up to the house. Sergeant Patino gets up, knocks on the door. Man sticks his head out of the upstairs window and says, "What do you want?" He says, "Sir, there's been a call. I'm going to need you to come." "I'm not coming down." "Sir, I'm going to need you to come down." Time. The guy opens the door. Opens it a crack. Look inside. See like 4 kids kind of on the stairs. Can't really tell that no one's crying actively. "Sir, what was going on?" "We heard that there was screaming." "We were singing the ABCs." Doesn't budge from the door. What do you do if you're a cop? What do you do? I mean, we tend to think being a cop, is easy. They shouldn't ever hassle people, but it's a very, very hard job. And so what do you rely on in those situations when you have very little information? your gut instincts. And those gut instincts may be based on color of a person's skin, tone of their voice, smells. Sometimes those things are really good cues. A lot of times they're not. And so I think that a lot of the violence that we see, I think it's undeniable that we have a horrible problem with racial bias in our system. If you look across the trajectory of a criminal case, as I mentioned, black men, higher bails, more likely to be experience police brutality, more likely to be convicted, more likely to get the death penalty. And in fact, the more stereotypically African American your features are, you're even more likely to get the death penalty. That's a really interesting study that was done, which said it's not just about the fact that you're black, it's how black you are matters. So I think the story here is we need to be targeting implicit racial bias. The big threat in this country is not, right, the Dylan Roofs of the world. That man was dangerous and he committed an atrocity. But if we focus on the explicit racists in our midst, we're not going to treat all these other problems. And that's what I worry about, is we're going to lose focus on the fact that good people with good intentions who believe themselves to be egalitarian can operate based on damaging stereotypes and negative affect. So other questions? Yeah?
I was married to a cop for 4 years, and it was not a happy marriage,
Yep.
and we got divorced, and I don't like him. I mean, I don't know. But I just want to say that I came away knowing how difficult that job is. And yes, there are a lot of hours where you spend directing traffic, but when you respond to domestic violence, when you stop a car and you don't know whether they have a gun or not, it takes a certain personality to be able to deal with that. And I question, I mean, my ex-husband was not racist. Anymore, I mean, we all have some racism in us. If I saw 5 black men, young guys standing on a street corner at 2 in the morning, I'd be more scared than if I saw 5 white guys standing on a corner.
And a lot of people, I
But-
think a lot
but-
of people have trouble admitting to that fact,
Yeah.
and yet in experiments, when we test that out,
Right.
we
right.
see that that's true.
But how can you possibly propose, I mean, applying for a job as a policeman it's a hard job.
Yeah.
You have to have a certain personality
Mhm.
to be able to go into a situation like domestic violence.
Mhm.
You
So
I
think
could
it's-
never do it. How could you test them for racial
So I don't think
prejudice?
That we, so
You
I don't think we
can't.
necessarily need to, and I certainly wouldn't propose testing people for their. We actually have tests
Yeah.
that we
They
can
do,
use
yeah, they
to
obviously
test,
do.
so that we could test people and
Right.
say, well, you have a high IAT score, right?
Right.
You show a high degree of implicit racial bias, therefore you can't be a police officer.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the right approach. I honestly don't. I think the better approach, and there's also good research on this, is figuring out how to get people to control any implicit biases that they have. So one of the interesting things with respect to shooter bias that the research shows is that when cops are given particular simulator training, which really teaches them to hold their fire until they are certain, they may still carry those implicit associations which link blackness and crime, but they don't act on it. So really interesting simulator work where basically they flash images on the screen of different black men or white men in urban settings, and they're either in their hand holding a gun, or it's a cell phone or a wallet or keys
Or a
something.
plastic gun.
Yeah, or in this particular right, with the recent shooting, and I guess it was Cleveland. So anyway, holding either a gun or a cell phone or keys or something like that. And it turns out in this experiment, just as you'd expect, when it's stereotype congruent, white guy and wallet, that's very easy for people not to make a mistake. When it's black guy in a wallet, they make a lot more errors. And that's a real problem. The good news is that when people have been undergone extensive training, which teaches them to hold their fire, they have the same slower reaction time, but they don't act on it. So I think that's a promising step. I think the other thing that we're learning more and more about is how to actually disrupt these damaging stereotypes. That, what I was talking about, was about controlling stereotypes. There are actually ways that we can disrupt the stereotypes, and it's been very effective. So the methods are quite simple, right? If you flash up images to someone, right, positive black images, right, Martin Luther King, and negative white images, so Charles Manson, that disrupts these stereotypes, and so people then don't act on them. The question for scientists right now is, we can get these things to work for a short period of time. Is there a way to get them to work for a longer period of time to really change behavior more generally? One of the things that we're probably going to have to do as a society is start paying attention to how different people are depicted in our culture. That's probably the only long-term solution, I think, that's really going to work. So, other questions? Yeah.
This is very fascinating and really interesting. I'm wondering, because I haven't read the book, because you seem to be talking in a certain way more about how we determine whether somebody is guilty or not. What about, let's assume that you got it right and somebody's guilty. What about, do you talk at all about our adversarial justice system, and also the difference that punishment versus restitution and how all that can fit into maybe preventing crime from reoccurring?
Absolutely. So I really, in this book, I try to get every character, right? So, a couple of the chapters, I have a chapter that really focuses on the question of why we punish. And then I have a chapter that really focuses on how we punish. And in both cases, I suggest, we don't know the real reasons that we are driven to punish. So most people, if you ask them, say, well, we punish basically to make our world a safer place. That's why we have the death penalty. That's why we have harsh mandatory minimum sentences. It's to make the streets safer. It's to deter and incapacitate. So this is some of the research. A lot of the research that I discussed in the book is by other researchers. This is actually research that a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, cognitive psychologist Jeff Goodwin, and I received a National Science Foundation grant to look at this question. Is it true that we're all about sort of what we would call consequentialist or utilitarian considerations, right? Making the world safer. Well, in our experiments, what we find is often people are driven by this basic desire for payback, for retribution. And I think that explains our tolerance for some things that we really say we do not stand for. For instance, tolerating rape in prison. Thousands of people are sexually assaulted in prisons. How do we allow that? These people are under our total control. And we allow horrible crime within our prisons. Why? I think it has to do with the fact that on some deep level, we think that's what they deserve. I think that's really upsetting, but we need to confront that fact. Second, punishment of children. We set up an entire separate system to deal with juvenile offenders. The idea being the juvenile mind is not as developed as the adult mind. Kids are more impulsive. They make bad decisions. So they don't deserve to be punished the same way as adults do. But look at what we've done in the United States. So often, when something really bad has happened, we just totally disregard that it's a kid. Just because it's a really bad thing. We try them as an adult. We punish them as an adult. And so I think we really need to rethink how we punish. I suggest that we need to actually look for many years. Other countries look to the United States as a model. So my wife and I are just buying a house, and it's very close to this prison called Eastern State, which in the 19th century was this beacon for progress, right? So Charles Dickens traveled to the United States. He told a reporter, there are two things I'm most excited about seeing: Niagara Falls and Eastern State Penitentiary. The times have shifted. We need to look, in particular, I think, to Northern Europe. They have a very different model. Their notion is, if you create monstrous conditions for prisoners, you're going to create monsters. In the United States, as in Northern Europe, almost all of the people in our prisons, in our solitary confinement cells, in brutal general population conditions, are going to be released back into our communities. In other countries, we try to make people better. These people have come up short. They've hurt us. So in these countries, the question is, well, how do we build them up to be successful? We need to, first of all, make sure that they have a job. That's a very strong predictor of whether someone commits a crime again. If you have a job, you are much, much, much less likely to commit a crime. They try to bolster and foster family connections. They try to ensure that the relationship between, say, the prison guards and the prisoners is one of more mentoring and help. People are more like social workers in prisons in, say, Norway. Contrast that with what we do in the United States. It's all about hurting people who have hurt us. But by doing that, we end up hurting ourselves. What good does it do to prevent someone from ever being able to be a successful citizen? 4 out of 5 employers are going to run background checks. And if you're a felon, you're not getting a job. If you have not been with your family for 10 or 15 years, try having a good relationship with your son. So much harder. But if you look at these other countries, they do things like, if you're a young woman locked up, certain countries, you can bring your kid to the facility. Why is that such a bad idea? You have I have a 1-year-old, right? That seems like a no-brainer. And yet we don't do it because we have these blinders on that says, well, punishment can't have anything good about it. It's got to be miserable. But when we take that frame, we ensure that we will continue to have miserable problems with crime. So I think that's a great question. That's a big part of the book, is the correction system. Yeah.
So, does privatizing the prison system, how does that affect the system? And also I wanted to know if you have a chapter about evidence-based justice in your book that explains and give more concrete examples and exactly what you mean.
So I'll take the second question first, which is that I do talk a lot about the broader picture, in particular in the last 2 chapters of the book, which are really focused on both the challenges to reform and sort of the bigger picture, what we need to do. I also just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about a week ago, talking a little bit about that too, which offers sort of a preview of the book. So your first question, remind me again, was?
Privatizing.
Oh, privatizing, yeah. So my concern with privatizing prisons is, as soon as you enter in and bring in the profit motive, right, it makes these changes, which are very logical. I've been going around talking to people. People think it's pretty logical that we change what we are doing, right? Mm-hmm. Conservatives think it's a great idea because we are bankrupting state governments by locking people up. It's very, very expensive, particularly nonviolent offenders. Conservatives say, yeah, we got to stop doing that to save money and lower taxes. Liberals think, well, it's inhumane what we're doing. We need to lower prison rolls. Who doesn't think that that's a good idea? The private prison industry, right? Because there's a profit motive. And unfortunately, right, they make a lot of money. There's a lot of money at stake. And so even politicians who think, yes, this is a good idea, are getting campaign donations from those people in private prisons. So that's a problem. I personally think that we are at a special moment, and the fact that liberals and conservatives are coming together on this issue, I think we can overcome those special interests. I really do. But it's certainly a challenge. I mean, I think it's an undeniable challenge. Yeah,
We have time
You-
for
you-
one last question.
great.
In California, in the last referendum for knocking down 3 strikes, the major contributor was the prison guards union to not removing the laws.
Yeah, so I think that's the 3 strikes laws, in my opinion, and I know we've made some progress in California on that front. In my opinion, it is not enough. I think sentences in all states are still far too much. But I think it's there are still special interests who are opposed to reform. But I think if we embrace the data here on what actually deters people, we start to see that long prison sentences are a very bad way to deter. They really don't have much of an effect at all. What has a much bigger effect is if we took that money, right, from locking someone up for 5 years. I mean, a lot of these prisons, $40,000 a year. Over a 5-year period, that's a ton of money, right? And invested that money on actually more community-based policing. It turns out that if you want to deter people, right, what you need to do is enhance the perception that if I do anything, I will be caught. That's way more important than saying, well, if you do something, you might be caught, you might be prosecuted, you might get a jury that convicts you, your case might not be appealed successfully, and like 3 years ahead of this, you may get an indeterminate length sentence because you may get parole. That's way too complicated, right? People tend to downplay it. They don't focus on that when it comes to deterrence. What they do think about is, you know what? I see a lot of cops in my neighborhood. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to burglarize that house. See cops all the time, I'm going to get caught. That matters. So I think a lot of what we need to do is shift our resources from the very end of the system, right? From the punishment phase, move it forward. And I'm talking in the book about moving it forward to thinking about policing, but I'm talking about let's move it way forward. One of the things we didn't discuss at all tonight, right, is the causes of crime.
Right, so, yeah.
I have a lot to say.
It's the mother's fault. It's always the mother's fault.
Not always the mother's fault. So anyway, I'm just going to leave that as a teaser, but it's pretty cool stuff in there. So thank you all. I really appreciate it. We can talk.